we've learned so far, HTML gives structure to the web page, and CSS gives a style, whether it's font color, spacing, and all that stuff. But JavaScript, it determines the behavior. So it's like if you click a button, then it'll show you the answer, or if you hover over something. So there are a lot of things you can do with JavaScript. It's how you go from the home page to the About Us page from an organization's website. So you can do some really cool stuff with JavaScript. And in Repl.it, how you connect your JavaScript file to your HTML it's the second one, like just like this on your Repl.it. And in your index.html, you'll need to include this code. It's just script and then source equals the src equals, sorry, it says index.js, but it should be script.js because that's what the JS file in the Repl.it is called. And then you just put the close tag for the script. And if you just put that in there, your JS will be linked to your HTML, and then it will run whatever code that you have. And comments in JavaScript, well, you already know what comments are, but this is just the syntax for comments in JavaScript. So I know it can be confusing sometimes to keep track of the different kinds of comments and the syntaxes for them in different languages, but yeah, this is the one for JavaScript. Before we get started with actual coding in JavaScript, one thing I want to show you guys is console.log. It's basically the system.out.println in Java or the print in Python. It's just whatever you put in this parentheses will be printed out to the console. And you can see on the right side of your screen in Repl.it, at the very bottom, there's this black space for the console, and this is where it'll print it out. And it's very helpful for debugging. Like just this morning, I'm new to Repl.it, so I couldn't figure out why my code wasn't running. So I put console.log right at the beginning of my JavaScript to see if my JavaScript was even running at all, or if it wasn't linked to the page. And it was, which is why I printed out over here. So you can put it in different points of your code to figure out where your code is broken, just like you do when you're doing Java or Python. And it doesn't print anything out to the actual web page. This is just like a hidden communication between the coder and the code. And this, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. You get an alert from a web page. And I think this is the coolest thing that I learned when I was doing JavaScript is it's a really easy way to send this is you just say alert and then in parentheses, whatever message you want to send, and it'll just send it. And I thought that was really cool because I thought you'd have to do a bunch of extra complex code, but it's just the alert function. But it's usually considered bad practice to just do this for things like, oh, your time is up, or here's the answer to the game that you're playing. You want to keep this alert function reserved only for extreme circumstances. Like you notice that you only get it on other websites when it's like something really alarming and like an emergency or something you really need to be aware of. And it's honestly annoying to the viewer if you get this alert because you're trying to do something on the web page and so you get some alert that's not letting you do anything else. So you usually try to keep this reserved unless it's probably absolutely necessary. And then variables in JavaScript, they're different from other languages in that you don't have to declare the variable type when you initialize it, like in Java. So you just say let, and then you put the name of the variable equals, and then the value of that variable, and a semicolon. Always remember to put a semicolon. And even the variable types are different. So this is a string, obviously, in between two quotation marks, and then this is a number 1, so it's type number, and is purple equals true, which is a Boolean, as you know. But one thing different about JavaScript is that you can change the type that a variable is referring to without any errors. And you would get a lot of errors if you did this in Java, but you can see that isPurple was declared as a Boolean variable, but I immediately changed it to an array, and the code runs perfectly. Nothing changes. It's just that isPurple now refers to this array. So that's something to keep in mind. You have a lot more flexibility in JavaScript than you do in Java. Also, sorry, one important thing to note is Java is very, very different from JavaScript. So please don't think that JavaScript and Java is just the only difference is like the suffix of script. They're completely different languages. And I used to think that they were almost the same thing. I was so happy when I learned Java that I was like, oh, yay, now I basically know half of JavaScript. But it's very different, and a lot of people think that it's similar, which it isn't. And okay, so the next thing in JavaScript is functions. This is like methods in Java. It's just a block of code that you're organizing into different functions. The general format for a function in JavaScript is you write function to tell the code that it's a function you're about to write, the name of that function, and then in the parentheses, you can put whatever parameters you want. If you want any, you can also have empty parameters. And you have an open curly braces, and then you close it at the end with the curly braces. And inside you have how many ever statements you want. An example of this is a function called say hi, which has no parameters passed in, and I just do console.log hello, and it just, obviously that doesn't show up on the web page, but it will send a hidden message on the console to the coder, and I'll know that, okay, so the code went inside this function, which means it ran. And it sends an alert. So this is something that a viewer on the web page would actually see is an alert box saying, hey there. So if we're actually going to start writing JavaScript code, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have this code copied into your script.js file. And you can find this on the slides that are linked in the reference doc that has all of the links for each day. If you can just copy paste all of this code into your script.js file, it's a great template to have. And I don't think we'll have enough time to get into why we need this window.add event listener load. But basically what this does is it ensures that when you run your code, this function, the init function, you can call it whatever you want. If you change this to initial, then you're going to want to change it here too. Basically, the name of this function and the name of this function need to be the same. But what this basically does is that this is the first function that is run. If you have absolutely no code in here, nothing is going to run in your JavaScript because nothing initiated that code. So if you have other small functions over here that you did to better organize your code, but you never call them in this function, then those functions are never going to run. In order for those functions to run, you need to call them from here. And in the end, there's just a bunch of braces, but and that's more about anonymous functions and stuff that we won't have time to get into because we only have an hour today. But just copy paste this code and make sure that you start writing your code in here. And if you want to better organize your code, then you can go out and break it out into smaller sub functions that you call from this initial function. So a very helpful method is called add event listener. And basically what it does is you call it on a specific element. And remember that you created these elements in the HTML file. So here you're going to have to refer to a specific element, and we'll talk about how to refer to a specific element in the next slide. But you're going to add an event listener to that element. Right now, the event that we're listening for is click. So what this does is it's going to wait. This whole line is just going to wait until that event or that element is clicked. Until you click that, it's not going to do anything. But once the user clicks this element, then it's going to go and run this function. This is the name of a function. And it's going to run it once that element is clicked. So how do you specify what element you want to add the event listener on? So there are multiple methods that you can use to get a specific element from the HTML that you produced, and one of them is query selector. What it does is, I'm just going to run through the examples because that's a lot easier. It helps understand. So here I've declared a variable called answer button, and here I'm going to do document.querySelector, and then in parentheses, I need to put a CSS selector string that specifies what CSS attribute the element has. So if I have a paragraph element that I've given the class attribute of answer, then this is gonna return that element to answer button. So what querySelector does is it returns the very first element that has the class answer. And this dot shows you that you're looking for a class and not an ID. And so answer button is gonna refer to just that single element. But in this second example, we have querySelector all, which means that it selects all of the elements in the HTML that have the class answer. It's not just gonna select the first one. It's gonna go past the first one and select all of them. And so answer buttons is gonna have an array of all of the elements that have the class attribute set to answer. And another way you can select an element is, instead of doing just classes and IDs, you can just go ahead and do, for example, P, because it'll just select all of the paragraphs that you have listed in your HTML. You can do H1, it'll give you an array of all of the headers, header ones that you have. So that's a nice way to give a uniformed look or a uniform behavior to all of your, say, headings or all of your little buttons. You can even do that here. So if you want to, I know that was a lot of information, but if you want to put together some of the stuff we've learned so far, I created a Replit just so you could look at it. I also added screenshots here, but I'm going to go to the actual Replit to show you. Do you guys still see my screen? Do you see the Chrome Replit?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, cool. All right, so in my HTML here, it's pretty straightforward. It's just the starting code that I had here with that Replit gave me. I linked my JSS here, and in the body, all I have is a header with a heading with hello world and exclamation point as the text, and then I set the class equal to background. And in my CSS, you can see that all that the class background does is it sets the background color to like a light cyan. And then in the JavaScript, once it enters the init function, it grabs I have a variable called text, and I do querySelector to grab the first element in my HTML with the class background. So if I go to my HTML, the only element that I have with the class background is this H1 element. If I had multiple, it would only select this first one. And then I take that element and I add an event listener to it. So I tell JavaScript to wait until the user clicks this element, and once it does, then you call the remove function. And in my remove function, I say this dot remove. And this is something I haven't talked about yet. And the keyword this, I think if you've learned Java, you'll be more familiar with this, but the keyword this just refers to the element that I call this event listener on. So if I say this dot remove, it's just gonna delete that element. So if I've run this, we have hello world with the cyan background, and then I clicked on it and it's gone. It just removes it and it's deleted. Yeah, so that's a pretty simple way to put the stuff that we've learned so far together. This is our second function that we have, and remember the template we have here. This last bunch of brackets always needs to be at the very end, and all of your subfunctions need to be in here. Like this is one of the subfunctions that I have, not past these parentheses, or they won't be called and you might run into errors. Okay. All right, and I have another example to show you another handy tool that we have in JavaScript that lets you add and remove classes to elements. And that's a really helpful way to really have some changes in style and stuff with when you click on elements. So here, I'm just gonna run the code before I talk you through it. I have a text that says, click on me to make my background red, and then another text that says me too. So if I click on this, it's gonna make the background red, and then if I click on this, it makes that red too. So we can add, one way to do this is we can grab this by using query selector and then add an event listener to it. Say when the user clicks it, then we can make the background red somehow. And then later we can say, okay, when the user clicks this too, we can grab this and then we can make the background red somehow. But a more efficient way to do it, and notice that when I put in my HTML, they're both P elements, they're both paragraphs, and they don't have any other attributes to them. So over here, what I did is I took advantage of the query selector method, which selects all of them. So it selects all of the P elements in the HTML, so it selects both of these. And keep in mind that it returns an array. So if I went in here and I just said, like the previous example, text dot add event listener, and then I said click, and my method is add background. That's what's gonna add the background. Then we're gonna run into an error. Let me comment this out. We're gonna run into an error here because this is an array. You can't add an event listener to an array of elements. So if I undo all of that, if I undo all of that, here what I'm doing is I'm going through a for loop and I'm going through that array. Here, this I tells you the index of the array that you're on. So right now we only have 2 elements in our array. This text has index 0 and this text has index 1. So I'm going to start at 0, go through this loop, and then come back at 1, go through this loop, and then I is going to be equal to 2. So this conditional statement, I is less than 2, is not true anymore. So we're going to exit that loop. So the only 2 times that it goes through this loop is when I is equal to 0 or 1. So when I is equal to 0, it's talking about this one. So it's saying, okay, add an event listener to this. When it's clicked, call the add background method, and then add an event listener to this. When it's clicked, call the add background method. So the query selector, if you have like 100 buttons on your page, it's really helpful to just add all of the event listeners if you want them to act in a similar way. It's a very fast and quick way to add similar functions to them. Just put them through a for loop and you'll have it done. Why don't you use script source equals index.js script? Oh, I did. I had it here in my index.html file. It's just, I'm not sure. I think you're referring to the index.js part. It's just that I copied that code from one of my previous projects where I had index.js as the name of my JavaScript file. But here on Replit, they have script.js as the JavaScript file, so I had to change it here. I'm going to go back and change it in the slides as well if you guys want to refer back to that. But ignore the index.js part. It should be script.js. But yeah, so we go through the for loop and we add the event listener to both of these texts. So we're good with that. Now, what do we do for the add background method? So here, once we call the add background method, again, note that this event listener is added to the specific element in that array. So that element could be this text. So when we call this in the add background method, we're referring to whatever element we called the event listener on. And that's the first time it's this text. So a helpful method is classlist.add. And what this does is whatever class that you specify in the parentheses, it will add all of those, all the things specified in the CSS file with that class to the element. So it's basically equivalent to saying, okay, when you click on me, I want to say class equals background. And on the style.css here, you can see that all this does is changes the background color to red. So if I actually just did class equals background, then without clicking anything, this is already red. So that's all that's doing, class list.add. But if I remove that, then it's not red anymore. And then it automatically does it when I just click on it. So you can also, another thing I can do is I can already have this on. And then instead of add background, I'm going to remove. Oh, sorry. Okay, so right now both of my texts will have the red background. So when I click on them, because I said, ignore the name of the method, the function, but I said classlist.remove, which removes the background class attribute from my element. So when I click on it, the red background should go away. When I click on this, red background should go away. So this is a really simple way to put it, but you can do a lot of cool things with this in your website. And yeah, that's basically all that I have with JavaScript for today, but you can do some really cool stuff when you get into it.